What happens when you take the brutal formula of a Soulslike and throw it into the colorful, mysterious world of Italian folklore? You get Enotria, the last song. And after spending my first hour with it, I honestly have mixed feelings. Because this game has some genuinely great ideas, but it also has some problems that are impossible to ignore. Let's start with the thing that immediately caught my attention. The world. Enotria doesn't look like your typical Souls-like. Instead of endless gray castles, dark forests, and depressing landscapes, we get something much more colorful. The world feels like a giant theatrical performance that has gone horribly wrong. Masks, costumes, strange characters, and beautiful environments are everywhere. And there's something really interesting about that contrast. Everything looks beautiful, but something feels deeply wrong. You're not simply exploring a ruined kingdom. You're exploring a world trapped inside an endless performance called the Eternal Rehearsal. Everyone has a role. Everyone is following the script. And you're the masked one. A character who doesn't even have a mask of their own. Your goal is basically to break the script and discover why this world has been trapped in this endless cycle. And honestly, after only an hour, I wanted to know more. But of course, the story isn't the main reason we're here. We're here for the combat. And this is where Enotria gets interesting. The combat puts a huge emphasis on parrying. You need to learn enemy attack patterns. When you land a perfect parry, it feels fantastic. Enemies can become vulnerable through the unraveling system. And once you understand the rhythm, you can completely destroy an enemy's defenses. But there's a problem. The combat doesn't always feel as polished as it should. Sometimes attacks feel slightly awkward. Sometimes animations don't communicate their timing perfectly. And when you're playing a game that demands precise parries, that's a pretty serious problem. But when you're not completely sure whether the game registered your timing correctly, that's frustrating. And this is probably one of the biggest things I noticed during my first hour. Enotria has the foundation of a really good combat system, but it doesn't always feel as refined as the best games in the genre. And then we get to what might be Enotria's most interesting idea, the masks. Because here, your equipment isn't just about increasing numbers. The masks you collect can change your abilities, your playstyle, and the way you approach combat. Combine that with different weapons, abilities, and passive effects, and suddenly there's a surprising amount of build variety. And this is where I started seeing the potential, because Enotria isn't simply trying to copy Dark Souls. It's actually trying to create something of its own, and I respect that. But the question is, does all of this actually come together into a great Souls-like? And that's where things get complicated, because the more I played Enotria, the more I realized that this game has a lot more going on than it first appears. Let's talk about the masks. This is probably the mechanic that makes Enotria stand out the most. Every enemy you encounter can potentially give you something new to work with. Masks can unlock different abilities and bonuses, and combined with your weapons and skills, they give you a surprising amount of freedom. You can build your character around different playstyles and experiment until you find something that feels right. And I really like that. Because one of my favorite things about Souls-like games is experimenting with builds, finding a weapon that completely changes the way you play, or discovering an ability that suddenly makes an enemy much easier. Enotria gives you plenty of opportunities to do exactly that. But there's also a downside. The game throws so many systems at you that it can sometimes feel like information overload. You have masks, mask lines, weapons, passives, abilities, and different effects to keep track of. And during the first hour, I wasn't always sure what I should be focusing on. I actually think Enotria could have benefited from slowing down a little and allowing the player to understand each system before introducing another one. But once you start experimenting, things become much clearer, and that's when the game starts to become fun. You stop worrying about understanding every single mechanic and simply start playing with them. And then there is the exploration. This is another area where I think Enotria does a good job. The environments are visually interesting, and there are plenty of little details that make you want to look around. You're constantly wondering, what's waiting around the next corner? Is there another enemy? Another secret? Another item? Another path? And that curiosity is important in a Souls-like, because exploration should make you feel like you're discovering something, not simply walking from one checkpoint to another. And Enotria definitely gives me that feeling. But unfortunately, not everything is as polished as the world itself. And this is where we have to talk about some of the game's biggest weaknesses. The biggest problem I noticed is the polish. There are moments where Enotria looks fantastic, and then you encounter an animation, a movement, or an enemy interaction that reminds you that this game isn't operating on the same level of polish as the biggest Souls-likes. And normally, I wouldn't care that much. But in a game built around precise combat, these little problems become much more noticeable. When you're fighting an enemy, you need to trust the game. You need to know exactly when an attack is going to connect, when your parry will work, and when you're actually safe. And when those things don't feel completely consistent, the frustration can build very quickly. But here's what keeps bringing me back. When everything works, Enotria is genuinely satisfying. You read an enemy, you time your parry, you break their defenses, and suddenly that enemy that was giving you trouble is completely under your control. Those moments are what make me want to continue. And then you have the world itself. I really appreciate that Enotria isn't afraid to be different. It doesn't try to completely copy the usual dark fantasy formula. The Italian inspiration gives it a personality, and the whole theatrical theme makes the world feel unique. It's colorful, strange, beautiful, and sometimes genuinely creepy. And after only 1 hour, I was already curious about where the story was going. So, is Enotria worth playing? After my first hour, I'd say yes. But I wouldn't recommend it blindly. If you're looking for the most polished Souls-like experience possible, there are better choices. But if you enjoy experimenting, if you like discovering different builds, and if you're willing to forgive a few rough edges, then Enotria has something worth experiencing. Because beneath those imperfections, there's a really interesting game. The mask system has potential. The combat can be extremely satisfying. The world has personality. And most importantly, I wanted to keep playing. And for me, that's probably the most important part of a first hour review. A game doesn't have to be perfect. It just needs to make me curious about what comes next. And Enotria did exactly that. So for now, I'm giving my first hour experience a 7 out of 10. It isn't perfect, but it definitely isn't forgettable. And if the game continues to build on these ideas, there might be something really special waiting underneath the surface. The eternal rehearsal has only just begun, and I'm not ready to leave the stage yet. This is Panic Roll TV, and I'll see you in the next one. Keep rolling.